A wild Mustang stood right at her doorstep. It didn't run. It didn't panic. It just stood there, staring at its hooves, a soaked leather pouch, and a handwritten page dated 1894. No one had lived on this mountain for decades, and no horse should have known where to find that. What it brought wasn't food. It was a secret, buried for 100 years. Until today, it came back and knocked. It had rained through the night. Not the kind of storm that howled or slammed windows. No, this was quieter, steady. A long, soaking kind of rain that melted into fog as it touched the ground, turning the mountains of western Colorado into a blurred, breathing canvas of mist and shadow. Inside the cabin, Naomi Grant stirred. She hadn't been sleeping, not really. Since her mother passed, nights were more like long negotiations with silence. The kind where your body lies still, but your mind paces. Wandering. Remembering. Forgetting. Then remembering again. This cabin had once been her mother's sanctuary, tucked far from town, buried in tall pines, perched just below the tree line like a secret. Now, it was Naomi's retreat. Or exile, depending on the day. She had left her research job 2 months ago. Left her apartment in Fort Collins. Left a life of conference calls, soil samples, and drought data reports. What she hadn't left behind were the questions. Especially the one that always came before dawn: what am I even doing here? That's when it came, the sound. Knock. Not loud, but distinct. Measured. Almost polite. Naomi sat up, unsure she'd heard anything at all. The rain was still tapping its rhythms against the tin roof. The old beams creaked like they always did when the temperature dropped. Maybe it had just been the wind. Knock. Knock. Her breath caught. It was coming from the front door. Not the side panel. Not the windows. The door. Someone, or something, was standing on her porch. At 5 a.m, in the middle of nowhere. She rose slowly, every muscle rigid with instinct. No neighbors for miles. No cell signal. No vehicle tracks on the muddy road she'd driven up 3 days earlier. Naomi moved to the side window, careful not to disturb the curtain. But what she saw stopped her cold. There was no man. No stranger with a flashlight. No lost hiker. No mountain lion. It was a horse. A Mustang. Wild. Untethered. Standing still in the rain. Head lifted. Ears forward. Watching the door. She blinked, stunned. The porch light, dim and old, cast a soft amber glow through the fog. It caught the sheen of his coat, frosted chestnut, damp but strong, glistening like something carved from wet copper. His mane clung to his neck in dark, tangled ropes. Mud caked his lower legs. And still, he didn't move. Naomi whispered aloud, "What the hell?" She crept toward the door. Not opening it. Just closer. Every step slow, measured. Her hand shook a little, half from confusion, half from the way this moment felt. Like the air had thickened. Like she'd crossed into something not quite real. She reached the small glass pane in the upper half of the wooden door. The Mustang turned his head, slightly, just enough, and looked straight at her. That stare. Not startled. Not curious. Intentional. It was the kind of look you don't expect from a wild animal. The kind that doesn't ask permission or offer fear. It just is. Solid. Present. Like he was waiting. That's when she saw it. Near his hooves, dark against the soaked wooden planks of the porch, was something that didn't belong. A bundle. A pouch. Leather. Old. Waterlogged. Frayed at the seams. And next to it, pressed partly underneath, a piece of parchment, yellowed, creased, clearly aged, barely holding its shape under the rain. Naomi squinted. There were markings on the paper. Not random stains. Writing. She could see lines, and at the top, a date. 1894. She stumbled back from the door as if someone had slapped her. This had to be a mistake. A prank. An illusion made by sleep deprivation and isolation and too much unresolved grief. But it wasn't. The Mustang still stood there. Still staring. Still waiting. She hesitated, heart pounding so hard it filled her ears. No one had lived on this mountain in decades. No trails led past this cabin anymore. The old ranger road that once connected it to civilization had been overgrown and abandoned years before Naomi was even born. And no wild horse, no matter how lost or desperate, should have been able to carry something like that or deliver it. She glanced down at her boots. At the floorboards. At the old photograph of her mother that still sat on the mantel above the fireplace, as if watching. Something was happening here. Something that defied what she knew about nature. About logic. About how the world worked. Naomi closed her eyes for a moment. Drew in a breath. Then stepped to the door. Her hand hovered over the knob. The horse didn't flinch. She opened it slowly, just a crack at first. The hinges groaned. The rain whispered in. Ash, she would call him that later, because of the color, because of the way he stood like smoke frozen in time. Ash backed up one step. Not startled. Not afraid. As if giving her room. Naomi stepped out, barefoot on the wet wood. And in that moment, under the gray wash of dawn, with the rain falling steady and a Mustang guarding something ancient beneath him, she realized this wasn't an accident. This was intent. She bent down and picked up the pouch. It was heavy. Slick. Her fingers brushed against the edge of the paper, thick, fibrous, the kind only used in centuries past. She read the date again. 1894. Her breath caught. She looked up. Ash was still watching her. The world had gone silent, no wind, no birdsong, no hum of the storm. Just her. The horse. The pouch. And a mystery that had waited over 100 years to knock on her door. One day earlier. The wind had been harsher then, dry and erratic, the kind that scraped across your skin like it remembered a time when this land had once been ocean. Dust curled at Naomi's boots as she walked along the edge of the bluff behind the cabin, following the remnants of what used to be a stream. She'd come out with her field journal, not to work, really, but to distract herself. The drought had pulled the land taut. Cracks in the clay had widened. The trees were holding on, but only just. Every leaf looked sunburnt, brittle. Even the crows had gone silent. The stream, once fed by spring melt higher in the range, had shrunk to a thin, reluctant trickle. It glinted weakly in the shade of a crooked boulder and disappeared beneath a patch of thirsty reeds. Naomi crouched and dipped her fingers in, lukewarm. Barely moving. She stood, brushing her palms on her jeans, and that's when she saw him. At first, just movement. Then form. Then breath. A horse. Alone. Maybe 50 feet away, barely more than a silhouette against the dry brush. Chestnut coat dulled by dirt and heat. Thin. His ribs were visible, each one like a line drawn in worry. He stood near the stream, but made no move to drink. Naomi froze. There were Mustangs in this region, sure, but sightings were rare. And this close to her property? Never. They usually kept higher ground, closer to the old ridges where people didn't tread. But this one, he looked like he didn't care anymore. Not about humans. Not about risk. Not even about surviving. She took a small step back, heart thudding quietly, not out of fear, but reverence. The kind you feel when something wild lets itself be seen. The horse turned his head slightly. Ears tilted. Eyes locking with hers for just a moment. Then he lowered his gaze again, as if her presence was neither threat nor comfort. Just part of the fading landscape. Naomi looked down at her bag. She hadn't brought much. A pen. A sketch pad. A half-eaten apple from breakfast. She hesitated. Then reached in and pulled the apple free, still cool from the morning. She didn't say anything. No words. No soothing noises. Just walked, slow, steady, toward the large flat stone near the stream. It sat under a lean pine, half in shadow. She placed the apple there. A peace offering. Or maybe a prayer. Then she backed away. Step by step. Hands at her sides. Eyes never leaving his. When she reached the edge of the clearing, she stopped. Waited. The Mustang stood still for a long time. Too long. Then he moved. One slow step. Then another. Naomi held her breath. He approached the rock, nostrils flaring slightly, ears flicking once at the breeze. His hooves made no sound on the parched earth. When he reached the apple, he paused, head low, shoulders sunken, and nudged it gently with his muzzle. Then, in 3 quiet bites, he ate. He didn't rush. Didn't glance around like prey. And when he was done, he looked at her again. Longer this time. There was no fear in that gaze. No hunger either. Just something Naomi couldn't name. Not curiosity. Not gratitude. But presence. A question, maybe. Or the memory of a question. And still, he didn't leave. He stood by the rock a while longer, watching her like a sentry watches the horizon. Then, as the wind picked up again, he turned. Walked back into the trees. Faded, one step at a time, into the shimmering air. Naomi stayed there long after he was gone. She didn't write anything in her journal. Didn't move toward the rock. Didn't touch the space he'd stood. It felt wrong to. Instead, she whispered under her breath, almost to herself. "Who are you?" But there was no answer. Only the sound of dry reeds in the wind, brushing against one another like bones under cloth. That night, she hadn't expected to think of him again. She assumed he'd been passing through. That her apple had been nothing more than chance, a bit of mercy in a tired animal's path. She didn't mention it in her notebook. Didn't call anyone. Didn't post a photo. Some things, she thought, don't need to be recorded to be real. She went to bed early, rain whispering in the distance, thinking only of her mother, of empty cupboards and the long crack in the floorboards that had started to split wider. She didn't know then. That by morning, he'd be back. Not just with eyes and ribs and silence, but with something no horse should carry. Something wrapped in leather. Something that once had a name. A date. And a message. Intended for someone who hadn't even been born yet. But that was tomorrow. Tonight, she dreamed of hoofbeats in the fog. And a steady, quiet knocking. That didn't come from inside the house. The rain had not stopped by morning. It had softened, become gentler, but it hadn't gone. Instead, it hummed like a hush over the trees, soaking into pine needles and loose gravel and Naomi's every step as she walked back inside, leather bundle in hand. She hadn't spoken. Not when the Mustang turned and vanished into the mist. Not when she closed the door behind her. Not even now, standing in the center of the cabin with something ancient resting on her kitchen table, dripping onto the wood. She stared at it. The pouch looked handmade. The seams were coarse, uneven. The flap tied with what had once been twine but now resembled a soggy thread of animal gut. Naomi hesitated. Some part of her still hoped it was a mistake, an accident. That maybe the horse had stumbled on a hunter's old camp or a forgotten artifact dropped by a hiker decades ago. But she knew better. You don't find something like this by chance. Not after yesterday. Not after that look. Her fingers moved slowly, untangling the wet tie. The knot had swollen from the rain. It resisted her at first, but then gave with a gentle snap. Inside was a folded sheet of thick, fibrous paper. Stained, water-warped, the ink faded to a sepia whisper. She unfolded it with both hands, as gently as if it might crumble from touch alone. It didn't. The paper held. So did the words. Field Notes, May 6, 1894. The flood began before the sky turned. I don't believe it was natural. The water came too fast, too cold, and from a direction I hadn't expected. The ridge runoff didn't explain the speed, nor the direction the animals fled. The horses moved first. Always the horses. They ran before the birds flew. There was no thunder. No pressure shift. Nothing a man could sense. But they knew. I followed. I had no choice. Naomi stopped reading. The ink bled slightly across the bottom, where rain had soaked the edge. But the handwriting was clear. Neat. Almost too careful. It reminded her of her mother's script, ornate but meticulous. Every loop and straight line purposeful. She scanned downward. There were more lines, a longer passage, but her eyes drifted to the bottom. To the last row of ink, where the signature should have been. There it was. Faint. Almost erased. But legible. E. Blackstone. Naomi blinked. Blackstone? She didn't recognize the name. Not from any archive, not from local records, not from the historical societies her mother had corresponded with. She stared harder. The E was sharp, formal. The Blackstone trailed off like the pen had run out of ink midway. She traced the letters with her eyes again, this time slower. E. Blackstone. Then flipped the page over, checking the back for more context. Nothing. Just damp fibers. And the faint, unmistakable imprint of time. She laid the page flat on the table and stepped back. Rain dripped steadily from her hair and sleeves, but she barely noticed. Instead, she turned toward the cabinet by the fireplace, where her mother had once stored her old maps and reference books. Naomi opened it with slow hands, rummaging until she found the spiral-bound local registry from 1890 to 1900. She flipped it open and scanned the names. No Blackstone. No E. No variant spelling. Not in birth records. Not in land claims. Not in death logs. Nothing. She grabbed another volume, this one a catalog of settlers, mineral surveyors, and licensed geologists working in western Colorado during the late 19th century. Still nothing. But something about the writing felt scientific. Observational. Clinical, yet intuitive. Like a field scientist. Or a naturalist. Naomi went back to the page. She read the full entry again. This time slower. Letting it sink in. Field Notes, May 6, 1894. The flood began before the sky turned. I don't believe it was natural. The water came too fast, too cold, and from a direction I hadn't expected. The ridge runoff didn't explain the speed, nor the direction the animals fled. The horses moved first. Always the horses. They ran before the birds flew. There was no thunder, no pressure shift, nothing a man could sense. But they knew. I followed. I had no choice. The entry ended there. No location, no context, no mention of who he was, why he was writing, whether he survived. But the phrase stuck with her. The horses moved first. That wasn't a guess. That was an observation. A truth. One written not in awe, but in acceptance. She knew that voice. It was the same one she'd heard in her own research, in her own quiet notations when she'd watched plant life bend ahead of wind shifts, or tracked how moss curled its edges before a temperature drop. It was the voice of someone watching the natural world closely, intimately, and realizing that what we call instinct is often something else entirely. Knowing. Naomi stood there for a long time. Long enough that the rain light outside turned white. Long enough that the fire in the hearth faded into a glow of coals. Long enough to feel the weight of something old settling into the room. Then she picked up the page again. Folded it carefully. Slipped it back inside the leather pouch. And sat down, staring at the door where the horse had stood just hours earlier. No record. No author. No explanation. Just a name. Blackstone. Without a past. And a Mustang. Who had delivered the page? As if he'd always known where it belonged. That night, Naomi didn't sleep. Not out of fear. But because for the first time in weeks, maybe months, she felt wide awake. And something told her. This wasn't the last message. Not even close. The next morning came with a stillness that didn't feel natural. The kind that arrived not when the world was asleep, but when it was waiting. Naomi stood in the doorway. Barefoot again. The floorboards cool beneath her feet. Mug of untouched coffee in her hand. And there he was. Standing. Again. Exactly where he had been before. Ash. She hadn't said the name aloud yet. But it had already settled in her mind. Like something remembered. Not invented. He was wet with dew, not rain. The mist had lifted early, leaving the world sharp and quiet. His coat caught the morning light. That strange, pale copper with ash-dusted edges. Frosted. But alive. He didn't move. Didn't paw the ground. Didn't fidget. Just stood, as if placed there by some invisible hand. Naomi stepped outside. He didn't flinch. She said nothing. The silence between them wasn't awkward anymore. It felt known. Like a room long undisturbed but full of breath. She walked halfway to him, stopped just before the edge of the porch. He blinked once. Then turned. Not an alarm. Not to leave. Just turned. And began to walk. Straight ahead. Toward the trees. No hesitation. No glance back. As if he already assumed she would follow. Naomi didn't move at first. She watched him. That slow, steady gait across the open yard. The rhythm of a creature who knew exactly where he was going. She glanced back at the door. The untouched coffee. The half-read pages of Blackstone's journal still lying open on the table. Then she stepped off the porch. Quiet. Deliberate. Not rushing. But not resisting either. The ground was soft beneath her boots. Rain had soaked into everything, but the sky had finally cleared. The sun was barely up. Just enough to cast long shadows across the pines. Ash kept walking. He didn't follow the trail. Instead, he moved along the tree lane. skirting the edge of old growth where brambles twisted and light thinned. It wasn't a path she knew. Not one her mother had ever mentioned. It was deeper. Wilder. He was leading her. That much was undeniable. But leading her where? And why? Remained a question she wasn't ready to ask aloud. They walked for nearly 30 minutes. Ash never broke stride. He didn't gallop. Didn't slow. Didn't test her pace. He simply moved. A straight, confident line through forest Naomi had never set foot in. And she followed. Not out of curiosity. Not even for answers. But because something inside her had begun to shift. Quietly, without language. Ever since the moment he first looked at her through the glass. The same part of her that had steadied plant rhythms. Followed the turning of roots beneath soil. Measured how a tree knows which way is south. That same instinct now told her. This was not coincidence. This was something else. Something she didn't yet have a name for. Ash finally stopped. A break in the trees. A clearing she didn't recognize. Smaller than a meadow. But wide enough to let the sun fall through. At the center. A cluster of moss-covered stones, half buried. Scattered like old teeth in the ground. Naomi approached slowly. Ash stood to the side now, just watching. He made no sound. She moved toward the largest stone. Flat, rounded at the edges. With faint grooves withered deep into its surface. Not natural. Marks. Not letters, not carvings she could read. But the intent behind them was unmistakable. She knelt. Ran her fingertips along the groove. It wasn't the cold that made her shiver. It was recognition. Not of the symbols themselves, but of their age. They were older than any trail marker. Older than any settler inscription. They didn't warn. They didn't claim. They remembered. She looked up. Ash was still watching her. That same stare. Unwavering. But not demanding. Not expecting. Just waiting. She stood. Looked around the clearing. No signs of recent human activity. No boot prints. No trash. No markings of wildlife cameras or survey stakes. It was untouched. And yet, Ash had brought her here. She glanced back toward him. His ears tilted slightly forward. He stepped once. Then stopped. Not to leave. But as if to show her. This is the boundary. You decide. Naomi turned back to the stone. Rested her palm flat on its face. The stone was warmer than it should have been. Not from sun. From within. She didn't know how she knew that. But she did. They stayed like that for a long while. Naomi and the horse. Stone and silence. Not speaking. Not touching. But aware of each other. And of something beneath this place. That neither wind nor time had managed to erase. Eventually, Ash exhaled through his nostrils. Soft. Almost a sigh. Then, gently, he turned. And walked back the way they had come. Naomi didn't follow immediately. She stood a moment longer. Hands still resting on the stone. Eyes closed. Letting the weight of the place settle into her chest. Then she turned. And followed him home. That night, she didn't write anything down. No diagrams. No theories. She didn't try to sketch the markings on the stone. Didn't try to catalog the path he'd taken. Didn't even open her mother's maps. Because for the first time, she knew this wasn't something she was supposed to record. It was something she was meant to receive. And whatever Ash was showing her was just beginning. The next time Ash appeared, he didn't wait on the porch. He stood farther out, where the grass gave way to rock, near the edge of the woods. His stance was still, intent, not urgent, but certain. Naomi saw him from the window. And this time, she didn't hesitate. She packed lightly, no camera, no notebook, no compass. Just water, gloves, and a scarf her mother once used when hiking the higher trails. It still smelled faintly of pine and sweat and something unnameable, something like memory. Ash turned as she stepped outside. And again, he began to walk. But this time, the way was different. He led her south, deeper than before. Past where the forest thickened, past where the sun could fully reach. The ground turned uneven. Moss swallowed fallen branches. Bark darkened with age. The air shifted. There was no birdsong here. No wind. Even the insects had gone quiet. It wasn't the silence of absence. It was the silence of presence. The kind that makes your breath catch. Not because you're afraid, but because you know you've crossed the threshold. You were never meant to forget. After nearly an hour, the woods opened. Not into a meadow. Not into light. But into stillness. A basin of old rock, ringed by trees that bent inward. As if listening. Their branches didn't sway. Even the leaves were motionless. Like a breath being held. Naomi stepped into it. She didn't need Ash to tell her what this place was. Her mother had once mentioned it, only once. A half-whispered story by the fireplace during a storm. About a place known to the elders as the silent ground. A valley without echo. A place where the old horses came to die. Where, in some traditions, it was believed their spirits returned. With the changing of the seasons. To pass messages between worlds. Naomi had thought it was myth. A tale made up to comfort those who couldn't bury what they'd lost. But now, she felt it. The hush. The weight. The presence in the ground. Ash stopped at the edge of a rock slide. It wasn't fresh, decades old, at least. The stones were settled, moss-covered. But a formation rose behind it. A ridge face that jutted up and curved slightly inward. As if protecting something once sacred. Naomi stepped closer. The stone here was different. More fractured, weathered in layers. Like time had leaned against it too long. Ash moved to the side. Let her pass. She climbed carefully. Loose gravel shifted beneath her feet. One step at a time. Until she reached the mouth of it. A cave. Or what used to be. It had collapsed long ago. Partially buried beneath the stonefall. But the opening was still visible. A dark crescent, no more than shoulder width. Naomi knelt. Peered in. And saw it. On the inner wall, just beyond reach. A carving. Not words. Not symbols. But figures. Time had worn their edges. But not their meaning. One was clearly a horse. The lines of its body fluid, proud. The other, a human, simpler, more abstract. But the detail that held her still was their posture. The horse and the human were facing each other. And between them, their hands, or what passed for hands and hooves, touching, not held in struggle, not restrained, touching, gently, like a gesture of knowing. Naomi leaned closer. The surface around the carving was rough. She ran her fingers along the stone, careful not to press too hard. Every edge seemed to hum with quiet. The air was cool. Smelled of wet dust, old lichen, and something faintly metallic, like the inside of a pocket watch that hadn't ticked in decades. She didn't know how long she knelt there. Eventually, she sat back on her heels, looked over her shoulder. Ash stood in the clearing, motionless, watching, always watching, not guarding, not demanding, but present, as if this moment belonged not just to her, but to them. She climbed down without a word, didn't take a photo, didn't sketch, didn't mark the location on her map. Some places aren't meant to be cataloged. Some are only meant to be remembered. That night, as Naomi sat by the cabin's cold hearth, she didn't light a fire, didn't open a book, didn't replay what she'd seen. She simply sat, letting the silence return, letting it settle into her bones, the same way it had settled into that forgotten valley, where no birds sang and no leaves stirred. The silent ground, a place where memory didn't need a voice, because the earth itself had never stopped remembering. She returned at first light. No hesitation, no trail markers, just instinct. Ash wasn't waiting, but she knew he would be near. The way back to the silent ground felt different this time. Familiar, yes, but not welcoming. Not entirely. It was as if the land had shifted slightly in the night, as if it had exhaled while she slept. And now, it was waiting for something else. When she stepped into the basin, the silence greeted her again. Heavy, whole. Ash stood beneath the curve of the ridge, beside the same stonefall, not watching her, watching the earth. She joined him. No words. He stepped once to the side, then looked toward the collapsed cave entrance. The space felt tighter, denser, like breath held too long. Naomi approached the outer stones. Her eyes scanned the surface, the grooves, the darkened ridges, the patches of moss now slick with morning dew. Then she saw it, a piece she hadn't noticed before, a fragment cracked and jetting out slightly from the slope, half covered in dust, as if time had paused before it finished hiding it. She knelt, brushed it clean. A broken slab, no longer part of the cave wall, but clearly carved. Its edges were jagged, as if split by force. She reached out and placed her palm against it. What came next was not sound, not quite, but a presence, a breath, not of wind, not of her own lungs, but of something ancient. It rose from the stone, not around her, not through her, but beneath, like the earth itself was remembering something aloud. And then Ash reacted. He let out a sharp breath, a sound between warning and wonder. Then he stepped back, just once, as if startled by something unseen. His ears flicked, his eyes sharpened, and then he lifted a hoof and struck the earth. One solid knock. Not random, not nervous, deliberate. Right there, beside the slab. Naomi froze. Then she looked down at the spot Ash had marked. Her fingers moved without thought, scraping away the topsoil. Then deeper. The ground here was looser than the rest. A shallow depression she hadn't noticed before. Almost like something had once been buried, and the land had tried to seal it back up. She dug with both hands. The soil turned cool, then colder. And then her fingers struck something hard. Wood. Old. She slowed. Cleared it carefully. A box? No. Not quite. A beam. A fragment. No longer part of any structure, but carved. Like a relic. She cleared more. There, on the top face. Half rotted, but still visible under layers of dirt and age. A symbol. Two curved lines, interlocked. Surrounded by dots. Etched in the shape of a rising sun. Above what looked like a horse's head. Naomi stared. She'd seen that design once. In a museum display her mother had taken her to. As a child. It was Arapaho. A marker. A sign of transition. A symbol that meant between worlds. She sat back, soil on her palms. The carved wood resting between them. Ash stood silent. The silence around them had changed. It wasn't just stillness anymore. It was listening. Naomi didn't know what this was yet. Not exactly. But she understood one thing. This wasn't just a cave. This wasn't just a clearing. It was a threshold. And whatever lay beneath this land, whatever had once been buried and almost forgotten, was beginning to stir again. Not with noise, but with breath. With memory. With a single knock. On the floor of the earth. Answered. And heard. The first drop landed on the back of her hand. Naomi didn't notice it at first. Too focused on the wooden fragment still resting in her lap. On the symbol carved by hands long gone. On the silence that now seemed to breathe around her. But then came another. And another. Cold. Clean. Deliberate. She looked up. The sky. Just moments ago a dull slate. Had darkened without warning. And then it broke. Rain. Not a drizzle. Not the soft whisper of mist she'd come to expect in these woods. A downpour. Sudden. Complete. It fell in sheets across the silent ground. Saturating the moss. Hitting the stones like muted drums. Coating her skin with the chill of something old. Being washed awake. She stood slowly. The carved wood held carefully in her arms. Ash was still beside her. Unmoving. But his ears flicked. His body tensed, not with fear, but with alertness. Then he turned his head. Toward the ridge. Naomi followed his gaze. And saw them. At first, they looked like shadows moving through the trees. Indistinct shapes. Half swallowed by rain and distance. But then they stepped forward. One by one. Through the curtain of mist. Horses. Wild. Untethered. An entire band. Their coats slick with water. Manes heavy with rain. They emerged without sound. Hooves barely disturbing the sodden earth. And yet, they came with presence. They came like memory rising from the land itself. Naomi didn't move. Didn't speak. She simply stood. Soaked to the bone. As they gathered. They didn't charge. Didn't flee. They surrounded her. Not tightly. But in a deliberate circle. Each one pausing. Watching her. Their eyes were not fearful. Not hostile. They were aware. One stepped forward. A gray mare. Older. With a streak of white like a river down her face. She stopped a few feet in front of Naomi. lowered her head slightly, held it there, as if in acknowledgement, then stepped aside. Another followed. A deep bay, then a dapple, then a young filly with bright, alert eyes. Each paused, faced Naomi, held their gaze, then moved aside. It was a procession, not of dominance, not of submission, but of recognition, presentation, like they were showing themselves to her. Rain streamed down Naomi's arms, down her cheeks. She didn't wipe it away. Her heart beat hard, not in panic, but in reverence. She felt as if she were standing, not in a forest clearing, but in the center of something much older. A ritual, perhaps, or a memory too large to carry in words. Ash stood beside her, quiet, but proud, as the last Mustang stepped forward, a black stallion with a single white mark above his eye. Naomi felt the weight of something unspoken pass between them, and then the rain softened, not stopped, just softened, as if the storm, having delivered what it came to give, now stepped back to let the moment breathe. Naomi didn't move. Neither did the horses. They stood together. A circle. A silence. Bound not by rope. Not by force. But by something else. Understanding. Or maybe permission. The wild didn't retreat. Not yet. It stayed, watched, listened, as if waiting to see what Naomi would do next. The rain had slowed to a hush, not gone, just quieter, like breath after a long confession. The wild horses still stood among the trees, not retreating, not pressing forward, simply remaining. Ash had moved beside Naomi, close, still silent, but something had shifted. It was in the way the land felt, the way her fingertips tingled, the way the carved wood in her arms now felt lighter, as if it had served its purpose. Then she noticed the old trail, barely visible beyond the ridge, half covered in fern and rot. But something about it called her forward. She turned to Ash. He didn't stop her, didn't follow, just watched. Naomi moved slowly, footsteps soft against the damp ground. The trail curled downward, leading into a hollow of stone and vine. And there, hidden beneath an overgrown thicket of pine and brush, was the outline of something man-made. A structure. Wood. Faded canvas. A tent. She stopped in front of it. Her breath caught. She knew this tent. It had belonged to her mother. Not in the final years, but far before that. From a time Naomi had nearly forgotten. Back when her mother would disappear. 4 days at a time. Always coming back quieter, but somehow stronger. Naomi stepped inside. The canvas was brittle, damp, laced with the scent of old earth and forgotten things. Inside, everything was still. A rusted lantern, a folded blanket, a tin cup, and a leather-bound notebook, tied with twine, edges warped with age. Naomi reached for it, her hands trembling. She untied the cord, lifted the cover. The pages inside were filled, every line written in her mother's familiar script. Clean, sharp, controlled. She flipped slowly, skimming notes about weather, soil composition, wildlife tracks. Then, near the center, she found it. A date. Almost 28 years ago. And a single line underlined twice. They came to me the night I almost died. Naomi stilled. Her fingers tightened around the page. She kept reading. It was the third day after the bleeding started. I thought I was losing the baby. I had no signal. No help. Just a fever. And the sound of rain. I thought it was the end. Then they appeared. Out of the fog. One by one. Silent. Still. They didn't touch me. Didn't come close. Just stood. Watching. I remember the feeling. Like something inside me was being held. By something I couldn't see. By morning. The bleeding had stopped. Naomi turned the page. It was the last entry. Just one sentence. Written in darker ink. As if her mother had returned years later. Just to write it. They know. And they choose who gets to see. Naomi closed the notebook. Pressed it to her chest. She was shaking now. Not from fear. But from a kind of grief. That had nowhere left to go. Tears slid down her face. She didn't wipe them. Outside. The wind stirred gently. The first movement in the trees. Since the storm began. She stepped out of the tent. Book in hand. Ash was there. Waiting. He didn't move. But Naomi saw it now. What her mother must have seen. Not just a horse. But a presence. A sentinel. A thread through time. That ran deeper than anything a map could hold. She looked down at the journal. Then toward the horizon. Toward the place where memory had been buried and was now beginning to rise. They know. And they choose who gets to see. And today, they had chosen her. That night, Naomi couldn't sleep. Not for the storm. It had passed. Not for the cold. The hearth was lit. But something inside her was no longer still. The notebook lay open on the table. Her mother's final sentence. Burned into her memory. They know. And they choose who gets to see. She turned those words over again and again. Like stones in her palm. Feeling for sharp edges. For meaning. Ash had not returned to the porch. But she could sense him. Somewhere near. Watching. As he always had. As if waiting for her to understand. What he already knew. Just before dawn. She stepped outside. The air was sharp. Clean. As if scrubbed by the rain. Mist clung to the trees like gauze. The forest breathed slowly. Deliberately. She didn't call for Ash. Didn't need to. He appeared without sound. Just beyond the clearing. Standing beneath the same pine. Where she had first seen him. But this time, he approached her. Head low. Steps calm. Eyes steady. And as he drew close, Naomi saw something she hadn't let herself fully see until now. This was not just a horse. Not just a survivor. Ash moved like memory. Like story. Like something carved out of myth. But still walking. She reached a hand toward him. He didn't flinch. And when her fingers brushed the side of his jaw, something stirred. Not in the trees. Not in the ground. Inside her. A pulse. A flash. A stillness so deep. It felt like sound. She saw a ridge. Stone. Cracked by time. Wind screaming through a canyon. Not marked on any map. She saw hooves striking earth. Rhythmic and endless. Carving paths through snow and sun. She saw people. Not settlers. Not scientists. People with braids. With painted hands. Placing their palms on the foreheads of Mustangs. As if blessing them. Or listening. She saw fire. Ceremony. Bones wrapped in cloth. Buried beside horse tracks. She saw a stallion. Frost-colored. Surrounded by others. But then. Alone. The last. Ash. Naomi staggered back. Gasping. The vision vanished as quickly as it came. But the weight of it remained. Like smoke after lightning. Ash didn't move. He simply watched her. As if to ask. Now do you see? And she did. Ash wasn't just a wild Mustang. He was a remnant. The last of a line. That had once been revered. Not owned. Not broken. But kept. Protected. Guides between worlds. Her mother had hinted at it. Old stories buried in field notes. Mentions of Arapaho myths. Of sacred horses that returned each season. To the same valleys. Not for grass. But for memory. She had dismissed them. Back then. But not now. Not after feeling the stone breathe. Not after reading her mother's final words. Not after watching a herd gather in silence. As if summoned by something deeper than instinct. It wasn't coincidence. Not the apple. Not the page from 1894. Not the cave. And certainly not Ash. Naomi stepped back. Heart pounding in her ears. Ash turned his head. Eyes glinting in the faint light. And then he walked. Not away. Not aimlessly. Toward the trees. Toward the ridge. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. She followed. Because now she understood. When a human hears the breath beneath the stone. Truly hears it. The horses come. Not as animals. But as memory. As message. As guardians of something. We've forgotten how to listen for. Naomi walked behind him. Footsteps light. Lungs steady. And in that quiet morning, she didn't feel like she was chasing a mystery anymore. She felt like she was returning. To a story. That had always been hers. She just hadn't known. How to listen. Until now. The offer came in the form of an email. Straightforward. Professional. Polite. A research institute Naomi had worked with in the past. One that specialized in ecological anthropology and ancient fauna migration patterns. Had heard of her recent unusual wildlife encounter through informal channels. They were intrigued. More than intrigued. They were ready to act. They proposed a preliminary survey. A small team. Minimal disruption. Equipment funded. Logistics covered. They weren't asking for ownership. Only access. They even used the word she had once loved. Discovery. Stewardship. Preservation. Naomi read the email twice. Then a third time. She didn't reply. Outside, the morning mist curled like breath around the trees. The rain had passed. The air was still. Too still. Ash hadn't returned. Not yesterday. Not today. The clearing where he once waited was empty. The pine needles untouched. The air unmarked. Naomi stood there for hours, waiting, listening. But there was no sound, no hoofbeats, no breath beneath stone. Only silence. And a question. She knew what the right answer was. At least, on paper. A discovery of this magnitude. A herd that exhibited coordinated, ritualistic behavior. A potential connection to Arapaho mythos. A lineage of wild Mustangs possibly tied to a pre-colonial oral tradition. It could reshape entire fields of science. It could open protected funding. Establish conservation corridors. Validate everything her mother once whispered about. And everything Naomi had now seen. And yet, she stood at the threshold of the silent ground. Alone. And she understood something. That no textbook and no institution had ever taught her. Some truths do not grow when exposed. Some truths must remain rooted, intact, unmapped. Not because they're fragile, but because they're sacred. The world had a way of turning the sacred into spectacle. She had seen it before. Remote ecosystems converted into photo ops. Sacred migration paths dissected by trail cameras and grant applications. Ceremonial sites reduced to footnotes under drone footage. And if she said yes, if she invited them in, the silence would vanish. The ridge would be trampled. The tent, her mother's, would be tagged. The rock carvings dusted, measured, entered into databases. And the Mustangs? They would disappear. Not in body, but in essence. Their knowing would be diluted into observation. Their presence translated into data points. Ash wouldn't wait for that. He already wasn't waiting. For 2 days, Naomi walked the perimeter, retraced her steps, returned to the ridge, the cave, the old trail. No sign. Not a single hoof print. Not a snapped branch. Not a breath. But she felt it. The test. Ash wasn't abandoning her. He was watching, waiting, to see if she understood what it meant to be chosen, not for discovery, but for custody. That night, Naomi sat by the fire. No books, no emails, just a flicker of flame, and the weight of knowing. She reached for her mother's notebook, ran her fingers across the worn cover, flipped again to the final page. They know, and they choose who gets to see. Her breath caught, because now, it was her turn. Not to be the one who sees, but the one who chooses what happens next. She rose quietly, crossed the cabin, opened her laptop, and replied to the email. 2 sentences. No elaboration. Thank you for your interest. I've decided not to proceed with your proposal. She didn't hit send right away. She stared at the screen for a long time, as if waiting for doubt to find her. But it never came. Only a stillness. Only clarity. She pressed send, closed the lid, turned off the light. The next morning, as the mist curled once more through the trees, Naomi stepped onto the porch. And there he was. Ash. Standing exactly where he had stood. That very first day. As if he'd never left. But she knew better. He hadn't returned to be seen. He had returned because she had chosen silence, and in doing so, had spoken louder than any paper or proclamation ever could. Ash blinked slowly, lowered his head. She didn't step forward. She didn't need to. The understanding was already there. A bond unspoken. A contract sealed. In quiet, he turned, walking back into the mist. This time, she didn't follow, because the path had already been taken, and the message had already been delivered. The cabin was dark. The email had been sent. The decision made. There was no ceremony, no applause, no thunder to confirm the weight of what Naomi had done. Just silence. The same silence that had followed her since the first time Ash appeared. The same silence her mother had trusted and written into the final page of her life. Outside, the trees stood still. Moonlight draped over the clearing like a veil. Nothing stirred. Naomi sat by the window, hands wrapped around a mug of cold tea, watching the night thicken. She wasn't waiting. Not really. But part of her still hoped. For something. For someone. It was sometime after midnight when she heard it. A soft shuffle. A familiar weight on the boards of the porch. She didn't rise at first. Didn't rush to the door. She simply closed her eyes and exhaled. Then she stood, barefoot, quiet. She opened the door, and there he was. Ash. One last time. His coat shimmered pale under the moon. His eyes reflected nothing but depth. Still, calm. And at his feet, something new. A single stone. Smooth. Dark. Rounded at the edges like river glass. But with one surface worn flat. And on it, a set of markings. Not letters. Not English. But carved lines. Intentional. Precise. Naomi knelt, fingers brushing the cool face of the stone. She recognized the style. Her mother had once shown her an Arapaho prayer etched into bark. The shape of it stayed with her. Not for the meaning, but for the rhythm. And now, reading this, she didn't know the language, but she understood the message. Trust. Silence is the longest form of memory. She looked up. Ash was already turning. Slowly. Deliberately. No sound. No farewell. He stepped off the porch. Into the mist. Into the trees. And vanished. Naomi didn't cry. She didn't call out. She simply sat, stone in her lap, feeling the weight of what it meant to be trusted with something older than language. The next morning, she wrapped the stone in cloth and buried it beneath the roots of the tallest pine outside the cabin. No marker, no sign, just earth and intent. A place to remember, not by visiting, but by protecting. She never spoke of Ash again. Not to colleagues. Not to friends. Not even in the margins of her field journal. But she stayed. In the cabin. On the ridge. She watched the seasons change. Watched the trees bend and rise again. Watched the sky shift from storm to stillness. And each morning, she would walk the boundary of the silent ground. Not as a scientist. Not as a witness. But as a guardian. Because some stories, are not meant to be published. Some herds are not meant to be found. And some spirits, the rarest of all, come back not to be seen, but to remind us what it means to keep something sacred in silence forever. She stayed through seasons that shifted like breath, through rains that whispered and winds that watched. Naomi remained in the cabin that once belonged to her mother, on the ridge where memory slept beneath the stone. She no longer sought signs. She no longer needed to, because some mornings, before the light reached the trees, before the birds began their chorus, there would be a sound, faint, gentle, like a reminder, a soft knock on the wooden floorboards just outside her door. She never rushed to check. She didn't need to. It wasn't about proof. It was about presence. She lived not to document, but to remember. Not to preserve facts, but to protect silence. Because there are stories that do not end. They simply shift form. And every morning, as mist lifted from the trees, and the sky unfolded its first breath of color, Naomi would walk the boundary of the silent ground, not out of duty, out of reverence, as if her footsteps were a way of saying, I'm still listening. I'm still here. Nature doesn't just see us. It remembers. And sometimes, a single act of quiet kindness can awaken something that has been buried for 100 years. Not in stone, but in spirit. There are connections that can't be measured with logic, only felt through respect. And there are wild souls who do not come to us to be tamed or saved, but to remind us some memories don't belong to history. They belong to the sacred. If this story touched you, please leave a comment below. Share your thoughts. Pass this story on to those who also believe that between humans and nature, there is always an invisible thread that never breaks. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Gallop of Glory so you won't miss the next journeys with wild Mustangs and the memories that time can never erase. Because some stories only begin when we become silent enough to truly listen.